Hey, I'm Ted Santos from Straight Talk, and you all know me. We are the talk show that's made for men by men, except ladies, you never want to miss our show. And if you look at me, I'm out in the bush, the woods. I'm in New Jersey and not too far from Manhattan. If you actually look over there, you can see some of those really tall buildings in Manhattan right at Columbus Circle. Won't let me zoom in on that. But as you can see, out in the wilderness, right? Hanging out in the bush. And I'm doing that for a reason for this. And I'm doing that because the wilderness, natural resources, hell, if we went back 200 years, this whole area right here in New Jersey would have been very wooded. You know, this ecosystem here has quite a few animals: deer, fox, groundhogs, skunks. You know, we have lots of animals running around. It's not a huge wooded area, and as you see, we have a lake. They fill it with trout in the springtime. But I want to make it relevant to a conversation that I had on our talk show. And you know, we do every Sunday. Straight Talk comes to you live at 7 p.m. and we talk about relationships, social issues, generational wealth. And this Sunday on April 12th, as in many of our shows, I ask a question, and this time I asked, should the black community should the black community be ruled by draconian laws? In other words, should the black community be ruled with an iron fist? You know, like severe punishment for wrongdoing. And we looked at a lot of things, and to take this conversation, you really kind of have to look at several things, because so much of the sabotage behavior in the black community and the dysfunction is rarely discussed. You know, we have guys like Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson who will talk to you all day long about racism and how horrible white America or even Hispanic and Asian community treats the black community here in the United States. Except we don't really talk about the dysfunction, and in talking about draconian laws and an iron fist, I looked at what actually happens in the black community. So you look at black Americans making up a little less than 15% of the U.S. population, right? We've got, about 329 million people in the U.S. About 45 million of those people are what they classify as black American. And out of, let's say, 15% of the total population, 37% of violent crimes are committed by that 15% black Americans. I mean, that's a lot. That's doing more than your share of violent crimes. And when you look at homicide, black Americans commit 52% of the homicides, the murders in the United States. I mean, that's huge. And are we really dealing with that? Or are we just sweeping it under the rug? And if you look at some of the other things, like youth suicides, right? If we look at the United States as a whole, and we look at how single parenting, single mothers specifically, is having an impact on our society, and it's even more prevalent in the black American community, having single mothers. And it's not even counting the amount of mothers who have multiple children by multiple men. Except 63% of suicides happen in the single mother household. And on the show we did this past Sunday, we talked about that. We talked about 90% of all homeless and runaway youths come out of a single mother home. 85% of all children that exhibit behavioral disorders come out of single mother homes. 71% of high school dropouts, once again, out of the single-parent home. Juvenile detention rates, 70% of juveniles in state-operated institutions, once again, they come out of the single-mother household. Like, are we seeing a pattern? And if there's a much bigger number of Black American children, like over 70% of Black American children are raised in a single-parent household, it's like 3/4 of the children. 75% of adolescent patients in substance abuse, once again, out of the single-mother household. 75% of rapists motivated by displaced anger, once again, coming out of single-mother households. So we can talk about racism, right? We can talk about disadvantaged households. Clearly, it's saying disadvantaged household is not having a father in it. If 70% of the youths are in detention centers. So it seems what is being done to support the Black community, like there's been affirmative action, there's been welfare, and still you have these statistics. And I understand there are some people who don't want to talk about the statistics. They'll say, well, they could be bad. If you look at the CDC, Black women in the U.S. are more likely to be verbally and physically abusive to their children than any other ethnic group in the U.S. And you think being verbally and physically abusive is not going to have an impact on that child as they grow older? It's not even talking about the amount of boys and girls, but boys who are actually raped and sexually molested in their household. You know, the mother's seeing a guy who helps pay the bills and he takes other liberties from the daughters or the sons. And these children are growing up. This is not just behavioral problems, there's trauma. On this show, we also talked about the emotional trauma and how in your brain, the same section of your brain that registers physical pain is the same section that registers emotional trauma. So physical and emotional trauma, the brain is registering it, and that's setting you up for how you see the world, what you fear, what you want to avoid, how you see yourself, how you survive, right? How protective and defensive you become. And so having a single mother household has actually created problems in the Black community. If you look at it, 1938, there were only 11% of children raised in a single mother household. By 1964, that number was up to 22%. And you can figure after the Korean and Vietnam War, you had more and more Black men dying in those wars. So you would have a single mother household. But now, like over, 70%? 77% of children raised in single mother households. This is a problem. So, for all the people who classify themselves as Black American, African American, I'm out here in the woods because this is where the wilderness is where you find resources, natural resources, right? We survive off of natural resources, food, water, oil, steel, gold, silver, salt, platinum, copper. All these things that we use to make all the conveniences in life, right? And land just to eat, food and water being most essential of all for us to drink and even to use for industrial purposes. So the other thing is, in addition to needing natural resources, we don't even talk about all the dysfunction that happens. And one of the callers on the show, Chris, he said, imagine if you go to the doctors and the doctor says, hey, you have cancer. And you as the patient says, well, I don't want to deal with that. You know, that's negative. I don't want to deal with that. You're bashing me because you're telling me I have cancer. I'm not going to deal with that. Let's move on. Well, that cancer is going to eat you alive, and you're on a dead-end street because you didn't address it and deal with it and get it out of your body and take all the measures necessary. You let the cancer destroy you. Well, that's how this dysfunction and the statistics I just laid out, that's how they're dealt with, as though they're a cancer that no one wants to deal with. So the statistics continue to grow. I mean, you go from having 22% of children raised in the mid-60s to here we are in 2020, where 77% of children raised by a single mother, and no one thinks that's a problem, and we shouldn't deal with it. And when we do, we're told we're just bashing the women. How do you resolve it? It's like the cancer. How do you resolve something if you can't talk about it? So here I am, and I want to talk about this idea of reparations. And we hear so much about how, well, if white America, corporate America, who benefited from reparations, if they would just write us all a check, it would all be solved and we'd all live happily ever after. I'd say that's probably a horrible idea, because all you have to do is think about the average person who wins a lottery ticket, right? If you gave a reparations check of, let's say, $1 million to every black American, right? What would happen to that $1 million? What would be different than a guy who wins a $10 million lottery ticket? That guy who wins $10 million, most people, their lives are worse off. They squander the money. They spend more than they actually earned. And they're in debt. They buy houses, they give money to people, they buy cars, they go to this lifestyle that they don't know how to manage because they don't know how to manage money, and they have a mindset of what you would call scarcity. So they just say, living it up, living my best life, I have the money, I got the bag, all this slang that has nothing to do with building power. So I'm here in the wilderness to talk about power, because when you own your own natural resources, well, you have the power to make decisions, right? So instead of a check, if the black community instead took possession of land, of oil wells, you took possession of iron ore mines, copper mines, salt mines, water supply, land to grow food, to feed your people. And when you have these natural resources, you can what they call vertically integrate. So if you have an iron ore mine, if I own the iron ore mine, I'm going to mine the iron. I'm going to hire a lot of people. They're going to be paid well, and they're going to mine it. And then I'm going to give that iron, that mined product, to my brother, who has a company that separates the iron from the other minerals. And then he's going to sell that to our cousin, who's going to take that iron ore and turn it into steel and other products that can be used for silverware and steel beams in a building, or cars, or the cast iron to make car engines. And he'll make other products. But now we just vertically integrated, right? We took from the natural resource of mining it, separating it, manufacturing it, and then selling it to my other cousin, who has an automobile manufacturer. He's buying the refined steel, and he's making cars. And my sister owns a silverware company. She's making silverware. So you vertically integrate, you create thousands of jobs, and you create a ton of wealth. But you also start to have economic power, where you can start to make policies and laws. But if instead of the black community looking for handouts from the government, whether we operated under the same United States, or we said we wanted our own land and lived on our own land and had our own sovereign nation and our own government, could that be done? Sure. Right now there are over 900 what you call tribal nations in the United States, who are who look like myself, or much darker. And these are not people mixed with Cherokee. They are people who were here already before Europeans started, before they arrived. In fact, many of them were here before even the Indians, so they didn't mix in with the Indians. The Indians came from them. That's another story. But what I'm saying, you could network those 900 tribal nations who have their own sovereign nations and start to look at how do you build nations, right? But if you stayed within the jurisdiction of the United States and you have your own, instead of taking a check and you take natural resources, you can build industries and create jobs. The money's there. There are enough billionaires and black billionaires, not just Oprah. You have Bob Johnson. You have a whole bunch of them. There are plenty of them, not just billionaires. They're multimillionaires. These are people who can actually make the appropriate investments. And you build. You take natural resources, except getting back to draconian laws and an iron fist, even if we were given all the natural resources, with all the dysfunction that's there, with all the proof that a single mother household is breeding criminals, suicide victims, drug and alcoholic abusers, what do we do about that? What do we do about the stripper culture that's become synonymous with being a black American, or the hip hop that is gonna put a cap in your ass and these are tough thugs who ain't scared of shit, right? You're gonna have to do something about that. And so coddling people and begging them to change, well, that's one way to do it, right? Creating new policies, giving more welfare. Well, if you decide to rule with an iron fist, the first thing you want is responsibility. So draconian laws means you are ruling people with severe laws and punishment. Like Sharia law, you steal, you get a hand cut off. You get to steal again, you get a second. They say in Sharia law, a thief only tries to steal twice. He has no hands after that. And these kind of laws have to be exactly what women wanted, equal rights. Women get the same exact punishment as a man for any kind of theft. And perhaps you have to make being a single parent illegal, a single mother, unless you're a widow. You have to get rid of welfare, because that rewards women for having children, and it doesn't matter if she has children with the same man or 5 different men. But you also have to clamp down on these guys who are just making babies. So you would need an iron fist rule that says everyone works. Everyone. You'd have to get rid of the stripper culture. I understand some of you guys feel like you'll be missing out on something, but you really won't. Because if we had our own natural resources, we had our own land to build on, our own oil to drill, we need productive members of society, not strippers. So if we had an iron fist rule, there'd be death for some people, not prison. Because if we look what's happening in the black community, a lot of guys are not even afraid of prison. It's almost like a badge of honor. I've heard people on Facebook talk about 3 meals in a cot. So the question is, should the black community be ruled under draconian laws? Draconian laws were created in Greece by aristocrats to have severe punishment for wrongdoing. If you owed money, you could be turned into a slave. If you stole, you could be executed. Now, I understand there's a flip side to having those kinds of laws. Sometimes people rebel more, but asking and pleading with people and paying people to be unproductive, well, that just hasn't worked. So we need some kind of rules if the black community were to come together where you actually get them back on the rail, because we've been derailed. I mean, if you look at from 1944 until 1964. That was the greatest economic growth and prosperity for for a black community in the U.S. And after that, it was derailed. And single mothers, well, that just grew. Welfare checks in the 70s, they took a check from corporate America with affirmative action. So here we are. And when you want to talk to women about it, they just want men to come up with solutions. And women don't see how being a single mother is creating damage. So with draconian laws, with an iron fist rule, you'd have zero tolerance for certain behavior. But yes, you'd have to give people jobs. You'd have to train people. You'd have to educate them. You'd have to do some serious things like men who want to create a lot of babies, you make them sterile. They can't create babies. Same thing with women who want to have children with a lot of different men. You have to put these hard set rules with no exceptions. That means even if you're a ruler and your family violates it, they have to pay the same consequences. Even you as the ruler can't violate the own laws. So, how do you get the black community back on course? Well, as if men are waiting for women to do it and come up with solutions, that's not going to happen, because we can look at the past 5 decades, at least 45 years, where women have been running many of the households and claiming they have the money. Well, what did they do with it? I mean, how many black women are proud to have a $2,000 purse, or a $5,000 or a $10,000, and how many of them do they have? Why isn't that money being invested back into the community? How many billions of dollars do black women spend on weaves and hair products and nails? Why wouldn't that same money be invested back in a black community? So if you had an iron fist rule, there are a lot of things that would just come to a screeching halt, because it doesn't seem that people are able to maturely and logically think through better choices. So this whole idea of you can't stick together because black people don't trust one another, maybe the black community has to go back to segregation, because there was a lot more unity before the 70s, before the mid-70s. I mean, the Black Panthers, look at how that sprung out. You can look at the black unity that existed. Black power, black economic power was being created in the 60s and before. Like I said, 1944 to 1964, you had economic prosperity. And those children born throughout the 60s were born into an environment of economic prosperity, black power, cooperation, economic power. They were born into that. That is all they would have known if it wasn't derailed. Just think of the children born now in the past 10 or 15 years. All they know is technology. They're good at technology because that's all they know. Those children born in the 60s, that's all they would have known was black economic power. So, that was derailed. Doesn't mean it was killed, because the spirit of that still exists with many people. The question is, are people willing to take a stand and move in a direction that has black economic power? Forget about this check for reparations. If you're going to stand for something, anything, stand for something that will give you power. The ability to be able to create your own jobs in your own industries, your own products and services. Why isn't that the conversation? Why is the conversation still for a handout, a welfare check? I mean, hell, look at this coronavirus and the stimulus package. It's time for the black community to look at unity and what that takes. You need jobs. And yes, it's great that you ladies have an education and many of you are qualified to be in a workforce, but how do we how do we develop and raise the next generation? Do you want men sitting at home raising the children? Or do you want women raising the next generation? That means we're going to have to put men back to work. so that they can do what you ladies claim you want, is protect and provide. If we give all the jobs to women, well, we see how that worked. Black community has been a great experiment for that. So, do you think it takes what's needed for the black community is an iron fist ruler, where you actually create your own community and it would be segregated, so all the money stays in the black community? A segregated community that builds its own, it's a self-contained community, builds its own economy. Can you build your own police force, your own government? And even if you still get natural resources, then you're part of the U.S. government and economy. Having natural resources and building your own industries is how you get economic or political power in the United States. We are in a republic, not a democracy. And wealthy families, large landowners, and large corporations give orders to the government, including the President of the United States. You write the policies, you have them sent through lobbyists, and that's how you get things done. But you can't get there by being consumers and buying Jordans and Gucci. We're going to need an entirely new mindset. That means re-educating everyone, not the youth, everyone. Because we as adults, we are the future. Not the children. We're here now. We are the future. So I want to hear your thoughts. Like my video. Dislike it if you don't like it. Leave some comments. If you said something that I think is so way off and you have a better idea, I'd like to hear it. Share the video, because the new conversation has to start. And to be honest, it's going to be men who start it and execute it. But we cannot use the old mindset to build this whole new paradigm, this new dynamic. We have to think different. And natural resources is a much better path. Will we need an iron fist rule to make it happen, as opposed to waiting another 100 years? So give me your thoughts, share the video, subscribe to my channel, and I look forward to hearing from you. And don't forget to call in and listen to my show every Sunday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time at Straight Talk. If you're not in my group on Facebook, send me a friend request and I'll drop you in there. Talk to you later. Bye.